Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh and Linlithgow Renaissance Fencing Academy here. In today's video I'm going to return to the topic of sword design, and specifically I want to talk about Italian rapiers and how they developed over time. So the rapier first appeared in Italy around the middle of the 16th century and continued in common use in that country at least until the early 18th century. That's quite a wide span of time in history. And of course, the rapier did not remain constant over that long period of time. There were developments in its design by swordsmiths. So that's going to be the topic of today's video. Two brief notes before we get into the analysis. Firstly, note that I am talking very specifically about Italian rapiers. There were other ideas about rapier design happening in other countries around the same time. So I'm not talking about Spanish rapiers, German rapiers, English rapiers, or any of that other stuff. This is only about Italian rapiers. Secondly, I'm going to analyse some of the training rapiers that I have in my own collection. But also I'm going to draw on some photographs of some original antique swords, and I have borrowed these photographs from this excellent book. So it is called Le Spade da Lato al Museo Stibert, and it is by Simone Picchianti. So essentially this is a sort of catalogue style book that is produced in association with the Stibert Museum in Firenze, that's Florence. This is a really good book if you're interested in sword design at all, and particularly if you're interested in rapiers. I highly recommend it. However, be aware that it is an Italian language book. So a little bit of knowledge of the Italian language would help you to get the most out of this, but I do really recommend it. Great book, thumbs up from me. Okay. Let's get started with the sword analysis. Okay, so we're going to start in the mid-16th century, and I'm going to focus initially on hilt design, and I'll make a comment about blade design later in the video. But let's focus primarily on the hilts to start with. So in the mid-16th century, the typical Italian sword had a hilt like this. You can find these hilts fitted to both cut and thrust swords and rapiers, so those with more thrust-oriented blades, around 1550, 1560. So, consists of a two-ring or two-port swept hilt design. So that means we have these two side rings, so quite broad, chunky side rings with this flat section, and they project laterally from the plane of the blade. So they're coming out in this direction, both rings. And on the back, we have these three sweeping bars forming an inner guard or counter guard to protect the thumb side of the hand. And of course, we have the cross guard with the two quillins, and sometimes there's a knuckle bow here to protect the front of the fingers. But equally often there isn't. Obviously this one does not have a knuckle bow. So this is a typical hilt of the mid-16th century. So this is our starting point. Now let's look at how this hilt design was embellished and developed as the years progressed. So by the late 16th century, so the last quarter of the 16th century, a typical Italian rapier hilt looked like this. So it's still a two-ring or two-port design. One, two. We've still got the sweeping counter guard at the back. This one does have a knuckle bow, of course. But something has changed. This larger lower side ring has now been set at an angle. So it's not projecting laterally from the blade, it's looping down here. This is quite a clever refinement because this diagonal sweep of the ring here helps to fill in a little bit of this space, providing additional protection. And it meets with the bars of the knuckle bow. So this whole area of the hilt is kind of supporting itself, providing additional structural strength. It's interesting to note as well that the ring is angled back away from the direction of any possible attack. So perhaps that is to aid the deflective properties of any possible attacks. Not totally sure, but that seems to make sense to me. In any case, this becomes a very, very popular, almost standard design. Note also that the bars, rings, and sweeping parts of the hilt now have this round section to them. That's also quite typical of the guards of this era. As we proceed into the first quarter of the 17th century, we can see that that design persists with a little addition, for example here, of an extra ring. So just helping to fill in more of that space. And this 3-ring or 3-port design is very common in the early 1600s. And interestingly, it looks pretty much like what is portrayed in the diagrams in Rodolfo Capoferro's fencing treatise of 1610. So that all seems to fit together quite nicely. Now, as we move into the second quarter of the 17th century, we can see additional embellishments being built into the basic swept hilt design. For example, here we can see the addition of a plate or shell in the upper part of the guard, forming what's sometimes called a filled port. So in other words, that upper ring on the guard is completely filled with some sort of metal plate. And obviously this will prevent the possibility of the point of a sword during a thrust slipping through the guard and hitting the upper part of the hand. So that's also quite a clever refinement, I think. And also in the same quarter, you can often find increasing numbers of side rings being built into the basic swept hilt design. So if we take a look at this sword, we can see these two elements being combined together. So multiple angulated side rings with a filled port with a shell at the top of the guard. So this is a very heavily protective swept hilt here. Around the middle of the 17th century, we find a change in hilt design. And we move towards this, the cup hilt. And you can find variations on this. This is a very simple one with a solid metal cup. You can also find ones with decorative shells with kind of shaped edging and pierced parts to the shell and engravings and so on and so forth. But they all basically look like this and perform like this. So you've got the cup or shell here, the usual cross guard, and almost always a knuckle bow here. Now, interestingly, this design probably did not originate in Italy. It seems to have been developed a little bit earlier in Spain, around 1630 or 1640, and then been adopted by Italian swordsmiths a little bit later. So if we think about fencing treatises, for example, Francesco Alfieri's Rapier fencing treatise, which was published sometime in the 1640s, still shows the old swept hilt. But then from 1650 onwards, this design rapidly replaced those earlier sword design concepts. So by the time we get to 1680 and onwards, this has become pretty much the standard form of the weapon. Now, let's talk about blade design. In the earlier swords, you sometimes find blades like this, which are, by the standards of a rapier, relatively broad and relatively flat in this plane. However, you equally find blades like this, which are quite narrow in this plane, but actually quite thick in this plane. The blades are always long, over 100 centimeters in length, but there's quite a lot of variation in that. Usually they range between 105 and 110 centimeters, but they can be slightly shorter than that, and sometimes quite a bit longer than that. So this variation in blade type in the earlier period of Italian rapiers results in quite a variation in weight and mass. The average is about 1.25 kilograms. But the spectrum of weight, if you like, ranges from about 1.1 kilograms at the lightest to 1.6 or almost 1.7 kilograms at the heaviest. So you find quite a lot of variety in that early period, the swept hilt period of Italian rapier. In the later period, the cup-hilt period, so mid-17th century onwards, what you find is the wider blades fade away quite quickly, the really heavy weapons fade away quite quickly, and the swept hilt itself fades away quite quickly, and you're left with a weapon which is, compared to the earlier ones, a little bit lighter, much more protective of the hand, and with a definitively narrow blade on it. So these weapons average about 1.15 kilograms in weight. The lighter ends tend to be about 1 kilogram. Heavier, maybe 1.3, 1.35 kilograms maximum from those I have seen. So anyway, that gives you a bit of an overview of Italian rapiers. So we can see in the first half of the rapier period, there's quite a lot of experimentation and variety going on. There's more or less a linear development in terms of the hilt becoming more and more protective and heavier. But the blades themselves are sometimes heavy, sometimes a bit lighter, sometimes very long, sometimes only a little bit long, and so on. So a lot of variation. From 1650 onwards, the variation fades away, and you end up with a design like this, or something very similar to it, being pretty much the standard form of the rapier. By the time its lifespan comes to an end in the first quarter of the 18th century, at which point it was replaced by the small sword, a much smaller, lighter thrusting sword. So yeah, there you go. Hopefully that gives you some food for thought about the rapier and how it developed over time in Italy. Maybe at some point I'll do another video comparing Italian rapiers with those of other countries and talk about the differences in design feature, but that's a topic for another day. For now, I will leave it there. Take care everyone, and I'll see you again soon with the next video. Bye for now.